I'm going to get everything started. So first of all, thank you for joining. Welcome to our webinar. Today, we have as our host, Jerome Pasquero. He's our senior product manager here at Sama, and he has had a very long and distinguished career in the AI space. And he's going to walk you all through all the practical steps and nuances of how to choose a data annotation provider or solution. Do it yourself is always a thing. And yeah, he's going to have quite a lot to say. And since we're starting, we've already started a few minutes after the hour, I'm going to take up no more time and leave him to host. Anytime you want to ask any questions, please just use the QA panel that's on your screen, on your Zoom screen. Ask the question. We will answer it either as quickly as possible or leave it for the end if it's a question that many people are asking. If there are any other concerns or questions, please just send it in via chat if you can. Send it in via chat, and that's just it. So with that, please do enjoy. And again, welcome.
Thanks, Henry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. Very excited about giving it. I had a fun time putting it together, so I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, let's jump into a little bit of a presentation, how to pick the best data labeling solution. Henry already introduced me, so senior product manager at Sama. I've been really following AI for quite a long time now, and even before deep learning. I focus on innovation most of the time, but always also happy to talk about really what is core to what we do, which is data annotation, which has a big human-computer interaction component to it. So what are we going to be talking about in the next half hour, 45 minutes? Well, as promised, we'll be just portraying a little bit of the data provider or labeling data provider landscape out there, just so you have your landmarks and you understand. It's pretty crowded, but they are big categories. Then we'll dive right into the different criteria that you should be looking into when you're picking the right provider. That is the core of the talk. We'll start simple and we'll increase in the level of complexity and importance when picking your provider. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about data quality. It's a term that's used a lot in our industry. At Sama, we're actually trying to redefine what is meant by data quality in the context of modern ML development. And of course, we'll leave some time for questions. There's also going to be polls, the opportunity for you to answer polls here and there, run by Henry. Feel free to do it if you want, or just pass on the poll if you're not interested. It's just to keep things a little bit more dynamic. So here's actually, speaking of polls, here's the first one. What are you hoping to learn from today's session? And as you're answering that, let's take a look at the landscape out there. So on the left side over here are tools such as do-it-yourself or open source labeling tools. They're freemium tools as well, where you start with a freemium and then you need to upgrade to premium tools. I'll talk about it in the same category, or at the same time, the crowdsourcing tools. Most people have heard of these. Here are just a few names. Today, we're not really going to talk about those. I'm calling them tools, but they are closer to toys than to tools, or they won't get you to the level of quality that you really need to be serious about AI at scale. Another category that's important that I'm calling a general tool over here at the very top here, you can think of it as a continuum where on one end you have companies that are a little bit more SaaS focused, and on the other end where they're a little bit more service focused. These SaaS focused companies are typically newer or younger than the service focused. I'll put a few logos there, and they really try to push self-service in annotation. You might be able to tag on a workforce to it. And they're trying to stretch on the service side as well, because they've realized that at a certain scale, you do actually need a pretty significant labeling team behind the software itself. But they're originally from this idea that you can do everything through the SaaS. At the end of the other end of the spectrum here, you have these specialized and trained workforce. Typically, some of them used to be BPOs or still BPOs. So they manage the workforce. And they've realized that, there's a piece of the pie that they can get on the more platform/SaaS focused side of it. So they're also stretching, they're coming from the other side. And what we've seen lately is, for instance, some of these companies acquiring some of these platforms, TELUS acquiring Playment, for instance, or Cloud Factory acquiring Hasty. And then there's another category where there's not a lot of players, and Sama happens to be in that category. I'll call it fully vertical solution, where and there's not a lot, like where we own not only the workforce, own and operate the workforce, so they're employees of Sama, but also we develop and operate the platform that's quite mature. So what we're going to be doing is looking at a bunch of criteria through the lens of these 4 or 5 different categories, and picking when to informing when to pick one category rather than the other one. Second poll question: what service or solution have you tried to date today? So next section. What matters when you're picking a data labeling solution? Like I said, we're going to look at the criteria one by one. Let's start with a really simple one, just to understand the framework that we have over here. And that is the volume of data that you need to annotate. Again, you here have another kind of continuum on the left side, where you would only have just a few samples that are required. That's typical of use cases such as in manufacturing, where you're doing flaw detection, for instance, and you only have a few flaws that are possible. You have perfect lighting on your assembly line. In this case, it's for PCB defects. You don't need to label hundreds of thousands of images. You probably can get away with just a few hundreds, a few thousands. So not a lot of labeling required. If you go to the extreme other end, that is typical of the AV industry, then you have millions of hours, millions of miles to cover where each object, each moving object needs to be annotated. So depending on the number of data to annotate, just considering this particular dimension, if you're into a low data regime category over here, I would actually recommend that you do explore maybe using these open source or freemium tools, or these general SaaS tool. In fact, I wouldn't recommend necessarily going to a company that has its own trained workforce, because the ramp up for might be a little bit brutal, and you probably won't get the bang for your buck at that low volume regime. This being said, some included would be happy to do it for you, especially if you're seeing a longer term partnership there. But to start, it's always a good idea to start with the simplest solution, which would be in the top categories over here. Now, if you're talking about over 250,000 samples, images or frames, you can go with a general tool, a SaaS. Obviously, at that scale, you'll probably need to tag on a workforce. But I would recommend really going to either the fully vertical solution or a specialized trained workforce. In fact, there's no other way to get to that scale than to partner with one of these providers. Another criteria that you need to consider is the number of planned workflows that you have. We have clients who have a single workflow because they're just starting. So on one end over here, but we also do have clients who have dozens of planned workflows that are already scheduled to start over the next 6 months, years. Sometimes they plan 2 years in advance. So this is an example of about a dozen workflows that they plan on working. Again, examples taken from AV, but it does happen in other industries as well. So what do you do? Well, of course, if you have a single workflow, maybe two, all the solutions here on the left will be fine. But if you're talking about, over 8 or 10 or 12 and sometimes 20 workflows, it is doable by using, this combination of a SaaS plus a workforce add-on. It's just going to be a little bit more challenging. We recommend really going with something like a fully vertical solution. And the reason behind that is because this combination of having your own workforce and also your platform allows you to transfer skills and from one workflow to another, make sure that you can keep as much as possible the same people, because there is some kind of transfer knowledge that can happen from one workflow to the next for the same company, obviously. Another criteria to consider is your turnaround time, right? Requirements. So typically in research, it's not really a factor. That's not always true. I'm using this as an example, but if it's not really a factor, that's would be one end of that spectrum here. But in some cases, it can be very business critical that you get these annotations back very quickly in a timely manner and as expected. And in even more advanced cases, there are some real-time requirements, and you just can't miss a beat there. This is typical of, for instance, models in production that need or validation workflows, or even like workflows where the model does a lot of the weightliftings, if you want, the big jobs, but there are certain cases where we wouldn't trust the model, so that has to be sent to human annotators, either for validation or just for the work itself. So if you're not very sensitive to your TAT, your turnaround time, again, any solution will work. If it's business critical or you have real-time requirements, obviously, if you're using the open source or premium tool, you're depending on your own ability to deliver, and so it's not for me to judge what you're capable of doing over here. When you start having this combination of a workforce and a platform that are not part of the same entity, that might call themselves partners, for instance, the problem is that then you're really dealing with two levels of dependency, either the platform or the workforce, and sometimes it can be a little bit confusing who's responsible for what, and you can have this a little bit of an internal finger pointing that happens. That obviously doesn't happen when you're using a fully vertical solution. Someone responsible for the whole delivery. It is not your problem whether whether the friction is on the platform side or the workforce side, or the interface between the two. Your model maturity and where you are in your AI journey is also important. So on the left side over here, we have what would be considered maybe a proof of concept. In this case, you're operating at a very low data volume. You're looking for a high quality in your data because it's just a POC. It's probably a very narrow case. And the annotations can be noisy. And by the way, having annotations that are noisy and high quality data are not mutually exclusive things, as long as the noise is like pretty well distributed in your data set. What you're trying to do over here is just to get people excited and to prove a concept, but it's a very narrow. On the other end, though, you're training at scale. You might be doing it for multiple cameras, for instance. You might actually be in production if you're really, really, really mature. So what do you do in these cases? So if you're working with a proof of concept, I would again recommend at least trying with freemium tools or open source ones. CVAT is a good example, or these general tools with or without a workforce. Actually, I would always recommend you try it internally, where you do some annotations yourself for as long as you can bear it. If you move into the development, then it's totally acceptable to add a workforce. It will be a little bit more challenging than handing off the whole thing to a vertical solution or specialized and trained workforce, but it's doable. But if you really want to reach that level of reliability and robustness that late phase developments demands, or even production, you're really best to rely on a provider with stable workforce that works on a proven platform. So even in a specialized and trained workforce, make sure that the annotators behind are who they say they are. It's not atypical to see one, for instance, email address and multiple people behind doing all the annotations. This will not happen at Sama. We know exactly who our annotators are. The types of assets is also important. So if you're dealing with images that are static, of course, there is a little bit of subtlety in there. You do have images that are lower resolution, images that have very high ultra resolutions, but it's still kind of a contained amount of data and also a known. You can go up the complexity ladder in terms of the data, and that goes from images, high resolution images, videos, high resolution videos, and then in a totally different realm, which is a 3D point cloud. And so in a 3D point cloud, you have frames, and every frame you might have hundreds of thousands of points, millions of points, even more, I suspect we'll be seeing. So typically the result of sensing with a LiDAR. So obviously this is going to affect what kind of solution you should go with. If you're talking about images and videos, it'll be more of a battle around who has the exact specific features that you're looking for. In images is pretty trivial, so everyone has pretty much the same thing. In videos, some companies are a little bit more advanced than others, depending on exactly what you're trying to do. So I invite you to shop around for this. 3D point cloud, I've mentioned this already, is a total different game. Some general tools will claim that they can do 3D point cloud, but that won't be enough. Specialized and trained workforce, there's some that have 3D point cloud experts, but then again, the problem is reliability of these experts can be a little dubious. Whereas if you own and operate your own platform, you can manage both the training of the workforce, but also what it takes from a technical UX, UI point of view, a platform point of view, to really leverage and make that training come to life. So all of this to say that you're a lot more likely to get the quality that you need on these fully vertical solutions when annotating in 3D. So if these tasks require a low cognitive load, any tool will do. If the cognitive load is high, and I'm thinking about, for instance, a really fine segmentation, most of these tools will do, but you will see more pronounced effect, as you more challenging, I would say, as you stay up in this stack over here. Just because the workforce add-on, for instance, might not be used to the tool, or because the workforce is changing faster than it can learn. The data obviously is a factor as well. We should probably start with this. You could have clean and unambiguous data on one end, and this is a little bit of a joke over here, because that never exists. I yet have to see, a data set that is clean and unambiguous. And then you can go up in levels of complexity, with like all the sensors being noisy or some of them being noisy. There can also be just kind of embedded ambiguity in your data. I think these examples speak for themselves, but one that I particularly like is this one. If I ask you how many toothbrushes are in this image, that could be a little bit confusing, right? Well, there's one, but there's really two, because it's a reflection. Like, what do I do with this? Is this a statue or a person? What about this? I'm annotating bicycle. This is clearly a bicycle if you ask a kid, but is it really a bicycle or is it a sign for a bicycle? The instructions, and that's part of the same thing as the data of it here, can also go from very clear to requiring some human interpretation. So here I have a few examples. Is this 1 or 2 parking meters? That would be easy to solve, for instance. Is this a chair? Is this baseball bats? Is it both? Where it gets a little trickier is with the specificity of the data. If you look at this image over here and I ask you to, annotate people, well, I know there are people under these umbrellas, but do I annotate them? And then what do I annotate? Do I annotate like just a person or the umbrella with the person, or do I let go? And then we also have cases where you have stuff like, well, annotate the pedestrians, unless, you see less than 40% of their body, but then annotate all the children, but don't annotate the ones that are being held by their parents. So, we tend to add like levels of complexity over and over and like a cake, and it just makes things a lot harder to manage with a really big workforce. There's also the cases where images or the assets and the tasks, I should say, are subject to interpretation. So over here, if I asked you, is this an accident? Is an accident about to happen? This requires human cognition at a much higher level than other tasks. So if you're dealing with clean data and simple instructions, go with any tool you want. If there's high ambiguity in your data and high specificity in your instructions, that's where you'll start to see how challenging using these decoupled workforce and tool can be, because they're really two entities that are not necessarily talking to each other very well. And when you're talking about, it's the same thing about how to these tasks that require a lot of interpretation for instance, it's the same thing. But this is doable and a lot easier in a fully vertical solution because your team of annotators is stable, and then you can achieve annotation consistency across your data set. You're leveraging that. Domain knowledge. So, and by domain knowledge, I mean needed by your annotating agents. Obviously, when you're doing a classification task, for instance, here on the left side, there are things that are very easily learned or that are known from the get-go. Teaching someone the difference between a Bengal cat and Siamese cat isn't too difficult. In the middle here, you have these cases that are a little more difficult, but where the domain knowledge that is required is transferable, and it is doable. We have a lot of these cases at SAMA. For instance, in AgTech, you can teach our workforce to differentiate between a weed in a crop and good crop. It won't happen in 10 minutes, but it won't take 15 or 20 or 60 hours of training either. Usually what it requires is for the client to provide that expert for a little bit of training, a little bit of feedback until the workforce is able to, has acquired the required knowledge. And then there are these cases where it's deep domain knowledge that is required. These are typical in the medical industry. So obviously for these, unfortunately, I wouldn't recommend to go with a specialized and trained workforce of fully vertical solutions. So it's almost impossible. If you require 10 years of training in medicine, this is not something you'll be able to transfer to your annotators. So in this case, the general tools or the do-it-yourself or freemium tools is probably the way to go. Where we shine at SAMA is really for these cases where there's a little bit of knowledge transfer that is required, but it is, it is in a reasonable amount of time, and that will offload a lot of the burden of the annotations from your internal experts. To automate or not? So one of the big questions. So what we have here on the left side is, a typical workflow where the annotator is annotating the contour of a person with a polygon. So this can be time consuming, though they are expert at doing that. In the middle here, we have what we call internally machine-assisted annotation, ML annotations. There's a big buzz in the industry about this. So in this particular example, the annotator only has to place 4 points around the object or the person in this case, and a model, comes up with a pretty good segmentation. So at Sama, we do use some of these tools, but in a very pointed manner. I think the point of this slide for me is to say, be wary of a lot of the companies that pretend that this is going to save you a lot of time and increase a lot of your efficiency. We've run our own tests. We're doing this on a lot of projects, and it does help, but you really need to be an expert to know exactly where it's going to help. It will not help across the board by any means. I still haven't seen it, right? Again, just one of the many tools that we have in general. After a little bit of a ramp up time, we always get better, even with the 100% human annotations, and more efficient at annotating the data sets. So for me, in this industry, often this is a part of a marketed ploy to impress. Not to say that it doesn't work, but it definitely doesn't work as well as everyone pretends it does. And then there's a semi or fully automated annotations. And then there are multiple ways of doing that. One way is to have like this big model that might be trained offline, for instance, and that uses more resources, that itself creates labels through predictions. And then you use those labels to train a model that might be maybe an embedded model with less resources, or many different flavors of that. What's important to remember about these semi or fully automated annotations, it's that it's still ongoing research work, though we are seeing more and more, I'd say, successes in that domain, but also that ultimately you might have all these levels to come up with the labels and train the model. Ultimately, to know if that whole system works, you still need top-notch, A-quality human annotations to know that your system is really working in the real world, and not only in this like contained system of multiple models that you have created. So again, this area is more where like the human annotations are used for validation or are used for test data sets. Get to the next slide. All right, I promised you would talk a little bit about quality, one of my favorite topics, but this is not what this talk is about mostly, but it is very relevant. So the industry talks about data quality, and there are many ways to define data quality, but typically it could be like the number of assets that the number of images that a client thinks are acceptable, or after having been labeled, or the number of objects that they review, and whether the pixel tolerance is good on the objects that have been annotated. But ultimately, what the data quality really is I would say the product of, or a compound effect of, multiple factors, the main ones being listed over here. If any of these is not up to grade and to requirements, the whole thing falls apart. Or another way to say it, a little cliche, is that your data quality is really going to be your weakest link in this chain of factors here. So starting with the raw data, if you don't have good raw data, all your efforts afterwards are going to be pretty moot, or everything's going to be a lot harder. So if you don't have the right volume, if you don't have the right resolution or the right diversity, or if your data doesn't represent the data you use for your training, it doesn't represent your production data, you're going to run into a problem. That means that selecting that data as well, what we call data curation, is just as important. If you're, for instance, selecting just data that doesn't bring in new information to your model, and you decide to annotate that, you're not going to see an improvement in your models, and you're just wasting your time and your money. And then we have like this boundary between the annotation platform and the workforce, right? You need an annotation platform where you can really manage the workforce accordingly, but also where it allows you to do the annotation work in a very efficient way. So here we enter the domain of like UI and UX and a machine-assisted annotation where it matters and where it actually works. And of course, pure engineering things such as uptime. You'd be surprised by how many times in the industry some of these platforms can be done, and that has a real impact on the delivery turnaround times. The annotation workforce, how skilled they are, how you can train them, how reliable they are, how trustworthy they are as well, is a very important part of this whole chain. This is the domain of people ops, and doing it at a very large scale. Sometimes we have workflows in hundreds of people, thousands of people, and there are some companies that can have workforces of over 10,000 people. And then the feedback loop is just as important, because none of this will get better if you don't have a way back in there. If you don't have a way to train your annotation workforce, show them these examples that work and don't work, get the feedback from the client. So this is just as important as the rest. Now, I want to go one step further and say, well, all this is really nice, but all we're talking about over here is the delivered data quality, what you'd get back, those bounding boxes on these images, those polygons, those 3D these cuboids in the 3D point cloud that you've shared with the annotation provider. But that is probably not your end goal. Again, on this idea of putting everything on a continuum, and because the World Cup is going on, even though Canada lost its third game today. You have on one side, and I'm saying this just because I'm speaking to you guys from Montreal, Canada, where we have a big summer office. We have on the left side, like this idea of, I'm just interested in getting a little bit of like annotated data so I can get my pipeline up and running, put all the pieces together. And then I'll figure out after how to improve on the data and the scale. I'm just basically at the beginning of my AI journey, or at least for a particular use case. I would compare this to a soccer practice. Not a lot of value, but still kind of important. Then data quality that we've been talking about is actually getting better at some skills, right? But when you think about it, it's really just a very small part of the entire story. No one wants data quality for the purpose of getting data quality. And unfortunately, the whole industry is around that. Like, we've delivered really good data quality, but so what, right? What really starts to matter is your model performance. That, to me, I would use the analogy of scoring a goal, for instance, in one of these competitions. And the trick is to be able to connect that model performance to the data quality and to be able to play with that data quality to improve your model performance. But even that is not sufficient, I would say, because ultimately your machine learning engineering team will be responsible at some point for a business impact. Maybe not in the early phases, but what really matters in the end is a business impact. I compare that to really winning that championship, and it gets even trickier to connect everything that's doing in data annotation all the way to the business impact. But it is crucial in my view, and that's why I think it's kind of time to redefine a little bit what we mean by data quality. So, depending on your expectation from working with your annotation provider, if you're just going for these quality labels and you just want to judge them on like the number of rejected samples, that's absolutely fine. And any of the different categories that we've been visiting so far are okay. If your goal is to increase your model performance, you're really looking for a machine learning data partner. They'll be able to help you maybe even identify some of the classes or some of the situation where your model is not working very well, and what kind of data you should be annotating next to improve that model performance. And if we're going really one step further and trying to address the business objective, then you'll need to be very open with this partner, so they can really try to tie the whole data annotation regime and validation and re-annotation and tie all of this to really a clear business objective. So I hope that I've convinced you that maybe this is a journey, but we are seeing more and more companies that are understanding this and that are approaching, at least us at Sama, with the idea that they need more a partner than just someone who's delivering raw data annotations. So last poll question, I believe. Why are you considering data annotation vendors?
Yes, this is the last polling question. And yeah, I'll be sharing some of the results once we get into the QA section of this webinar.
Thank you, Henry. I have this slide as one of the last slides here just to tell you that at Summa we're really committed to understanding a little bit more that link between the data and the model performance, the data and the business impact. We not long ago released a complete annotation of the COCO 2017 data set. More to follow. We're running a bunch of experiments to see the importance, for instance, of I'm just saying this like that, but like the number of vertices around a particular object. We have a number of things that we are continuing to test on a regular basis to really understand a lot better what are these factors that can improve our model. And the reason why we're doing this is really to help our clients. We have a number of clients who come to us with some requirements about the data that frankly don't make much sense. I think everyone's scared of getting data that's not high quality and being like stuck at a certain level because you don't have bounding boxes that are tight enough, or vector or polygons that have enough vertices. But the reality is the link between those these actual data quality requirements and the real output, which is the model performance, are not well understood today. And that's one of the things that at Summa we're working hard at making sense of. So the first slide had an image that was generated automatically by OpenAI, by dialing it out OpenAI of a data center. Here's a real image that we have for Summa. Just a reminder that at Summa we are an ethical AI supply chain. But my point with this slide is just to say that behind all of this, behind all this AI excitement and future, there are still real humans annotating on a daily basis, and we rely really on them for moving the AI performance forward. And I will leave it up for questions if you have any, and thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
All right. Thank you, Jerome. So I'm going to just take this opportunity to, well, again, thank you all for your time and your patience and your attention. And before, there's not too much time left, so we'll jump into just like one question after I shared with you the poll results. So a question we asked early on was just what was your experience with data annotation solutions? As it turns out, of those of you responded, 80% of you have tried do-it-yourself solutions or open source solutions. And out of the name brands, 40% of you have tried Amazon Mechanical Turk, and some of you have never hired a data annotation provider before. So those are, and then beyond that, the reason why you guys are here is just to find out more about this landscape, and also just to find out more about Summa AI. So that's all great. Those are all great answers. So beyond that, we have just a little bit of time. So we've just got basically maybe one question, enough time for one question before our time is up. I'm going to out of all these questions here, I think the one that's probably the most pressing to just address a little bit is about crowdsourcing. And just so, Jerome, this question here is just, would you recommend a crowdsource provider if the provider guarantees that the crowdsource will have training?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, first of all, show me what kind of guarantees they can bring to the table, right? Like it's all in the details in this case. And obviously I'm biased on this, but what I will say about these crowdsourcing solution is that I see them a little bit as a race to the bottom. The incentives are to really work very fast, to make it almost mindless, so you can go through a lot of cases very quickly. I talked about this idea of security being an issue where you might have one identifier, say an email address that is shared by 2, 3, 10, 20 people behind just because that's the only way that they can get to volume. I just wouldn't recommend them on the medium to long term if you're really serious about bringing your models to production. This being said, there might be a good way to test some stuff initially for cheap, and that's probably how I would get started if I had a limited budget, but with a plan to switch as soon as possible.
Okay, there's one other question here. Somebody's asking, how often do you, us, I guess, not just Jerome, do you work with clients in the natural language processing domain?
Yeah,
that's a question. Yes.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I should have mentioned this. At Sama, we're primarily like a computer vision annotation company. We have done a little bit of NLP in the past. NLP is a different domain completely. For instance, like one of the challenges with NLP is, and one of the differences is that localization and the different languages that need to be supported is it can be a little challenging. Whereas computer vision typically doesn't require a force that is distributed across the entire planet, right? So at Sama, for instance, our workforce is mostly located in East Africa, and we have some in India as well. If we were to have to tackle other languages, it would be a little bit more challenging, for sure.
Okay, excellent. So we're just a little bit past time, so I'm going to just close this off by sharing the results from the last polling question. It basically all comes down to the same thing. Everybody everyone is evaluating things because evaluating data annotation solutions because they have significant increases in labeling requirements. Basically, they need to annotate more quickly. So I hope that today's webinar really answered all your questions, and then it's something to keep an eye out for both in your email inboxes and just on our site soon. There's going to be an actual interactive version of the content of today's webinar coming up soon. We're building up a data annotation solution assessment, a requirements assessment for you guys to actually go in and answer the questions and then get recommendations from us directly. So be on the lookout for that on our website and also in your email. As I said, that's coming soon. It's a complement to this webinar here today. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. Jerome, do you have any closing words before we go?
No, just thank you for your attention, and thanks for attending. Yeah.
All right, excellent. So everybody, keep keep an eye out for the recording for this webinar soon. We'll be getting it to you shortly. And for all of you who are saying that you need help with your labeling, well, I do hope that today's webinar helped you figure out what type of help you need. And if it looks as though we're the type of help you need, please always contact us as soon as convenience, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks. With that, I'm going to end this for everybody. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jerome.